Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to yet another Peaceful Change lecture, part of our lecture series sponsored by the Austrian Research Association. And for those of you who have listened in frequently, you know already that we moved from regional dynamics of peaceful change. So we looked at Africa, Europe, Latin America, and so on, to functional areas, basically suborders of international order, such as security, economics. The last lecture was actually on economics. And an increasingly important field is also migration. And I'm very happy to have a very renowned scholar on migration, on citizenship, dual citizenship, with us today. That is Professor Rainer Bauböck from the European University Institute, and he's also a member of the Austrian Academy of Science. Under normal circumstances, there would be a big round of applause now, but we just imagine that for the time being. And I'm going to introduce you very quickly to today's speaker. Professor Bauböck has worked on migration and dual citizenship actually for a very long time. As I learned today, preparing a little bit, he started doing so at least when he wrote his habilitation, which was already on dual citizenship. His research interests are in normative political theory, in comparative studies on citizenship in democracies, on European integration, migration, nationalism, and minority rights. He's been a visiting professor at lots of prestigious institutions. I just mentioned a few of them. That's the Bellagio, Rockefeller Foundation, Yale University, Central European University, Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, University of Warwick, and many others. And I have to say, when I listened to his talk, it was something like a year ago or so on Ö1. It's always, by the way, it's a really great radio station to listen to. Then I knew immediately that I wanted him to speak on migration, because there's obviously a lot of emotions always going on with issues on migration and citizenship, dual citizenship. And he has a wonderfully rational and academic access to that, deals with it in very rational ways, and comes up, I think, with very convincing arguments. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speaker, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Markus, Kornprobst, for inviting me. It would have been lovely to be there, to be present at the Diplomatic Academy. I attended many events there in the past, but now I'm trying to get used, like everybody else, to give a lecture online without a live audience. And I find this still very difficult, because normally I'd like to look into the faces of the audience to see whether they have understood what I'm trying to explain, which I can't do in the present format. I hope it will still go well. I will try to limit my talk to about 30 minutes, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. I have prepared some slides so that you don't have to look just at my face for the whole time. Let me just briefly say that, yes, I've been working on issues of citizenship for a very long time, much more than on migration, actually. I've discovered that citizenship is a topic and a field of study of its own, and it's connected to migration, but certainly not limited to migration issues. And dual citizenship is just one slice of that larger field that I've become also more recently interested in, because there is a lot of change going on in policies around the world. And I want to talk about what I see as a global trend of toleration of dual citizenship, but then also talk about the exceptions and the deviations from that trend. And that question arises because of my native country of Austria, that is one of the exceptions. And I'm still trying to understand why the rejection of dual citizenship is so strong in this case. But this won't be a talk primarily about Austria. I will focus much more on the global issues, and I will have one slide also on the specific context of the European Union. So this is the overview, the 4 points I will try to cover in my 30 minutes. And let me just start with a rather dry analytic explanation how dual citizenship can come about. It's important to understand that there are different ways how states can produce dual citizens. And it's very important to understand that states do so independently of each other. So they don't team up and say, let's have dual citizens, but they all have their separate nationality laws. And it's the interaction of these nationality laws that in more and more cases creates dual citizens or provides the opportunity for dual citizenship to more and more people. The 4 main mechanisms how dual citizenship can be produced are listed here in the bullet points. And the first one, and that may be a surprise to you because it has very little to do with migration. This is gender, the norm against gender discrimination that became very strong in the UN environment of human rights conventions in the 1960s and 1970s. In most countries, also in Austria, citizenship is bequeathed to the next generation through what is called jus sanguinis. That means citizenship by descent from a parent who is already a citizen. In the past, the standard norm in nearly all countries was you could inherit the citizenship only from the father's side. And the woman, once she married somebody, anyway had to change the citizenship to that of her husband. So that meant the children would be mono-citizens. They would only have the citizenship of the father. Now, once you say this is gender discrimination, you cannot give this kind of second-class citizenship to women. They have independent right to nationality. That breaks down because then you have citizenship for both from the father's side and the mother's side. And if the father and the mother have different nationality, it means that the child by birth will have 2 citizenships inherited by descent. The second mechanism has more to do with migration, and that's a combination of jus soli, that's the other ground rule of citizenship, which means that you acquire citizenship by birth, not from your parents, but through birth in the territory. That's the dominant rule, not just in the US. President Trump once claimed the US is a weird outsider. It's actually the dominant rule in all of the Americas, North and South, and in some other countries around the world as well. Now, once you have a situation where somebody moves from country A that has a jus sanguinis rule, citizenship by descent, to a country B that has a jus soli rule, citizenship by birth in the territory, it means again that the child will have two citizenships by birth. It inherits the foreign citizenship from the parent side, the immigrants, and it gets citizenship by birth just by being born in the territory. Even if both parents are foreign nationals, the child will be a dual citizen in that case. And then there is naturalization. That's basically when you change your citizenship after birth. In most cases, you have to apply for it, but in some cases, it happens also without your consent. But all states have rules that regulate what happens in naturalization when somebody acquires a new citizenship. Now, basically, now 2 states are again involved, and you have to consider this. There is a state A that has citizens who want to acquire a foreign nationality. And here the question is then, if in that case, it should be tolerated that that person retains his or her citizenship of origin. And if the state says yes, then again, there will be a toleration of citizenship through outgoing, what I call outgoing naturalizations. The other side of the coin is incoming naturalizations. So for country B now, the question is, should they accept that a person who becomes a new national retains a citizenship of origin? And some states don't accept this and require that you renounce your citizenship of origin before you become their national through naturalization. But more and more states are also willing to tolerate naturalization in that context. It should be already clear from this very brief outline of the 4 main ways how dual citizenship comes about. It takes 2 to tango. It's not produced by one state, but it's produced by what I call constellations of two states whose citizenship laws interact and in more cases produce dual citizenship. Now let me show you, after this rather dry introduction, let me show you some data, mostly produced by my colleagues at the Global Citizenship Observatory at the EUI in Florence, of which I am still a co-director. So the first slide shows you dual citizenship toleration in outgoing naturalization, so mostly for immigrants. And the trend is rather striking. When we start in the 1960s, we see that less than 40% of all states then accepted dual citizenship in that kind of context. And now the figure is at the range of really roughly 75%. So 3/3 of all countries. And we've measured here 175 countries. It's also interesting to look at the regional variation, where you see that in the Americas, it's nearly at 100%. There are only a couple of countries that are still not fully tolerant of dual citizenship when their citizens acquire a foreign nationality. Europe is roughly at the global average, and you see Africa and Asia as the two continents that lag behind. But in each world region, you see this rising trend towards toleration of dual citizenship. Now, as I said before, toleration in outgoing naturalizations is not enough to generate dual citizens. You need a complementary toleration in incoming naturalization to turn people into dual citizens. Now, have a look at this table where we then combine the two aspects and ask how many countries tolerate dual citizenship in both contexts, immigration and immigration, and how many countries do not tolerate it in both contexts. And what you see here is it's only 18% in our global sample countries, only 80% countries are left that do not accept dual citizenship in either case, either for the immigrants or for the immigrants in their territory. Whereas nearly 50%, currently 47%, so the clear plurality of states accept dual citizenship in both cases. So that's the dominant trend. And then you see also that there are some countries that tolerate it asymmetrically, roughly 1/3 of all countries, either only for the immigrants or only for the immigrants. And it's slightly more likely that states will tolerate it for the expats than they are likely to tolerate it for the immigrants in their territory. Now, together with IOM, the International Organization for Migration, we've also produced maps, charts where you can actually see how these 4 categories of dual citizenship toleration distribute across world regions. And Europe presents the most checkered picture. You see the deep blue countries that are fully tolerant, and you see the red countries that still, in principle, don't accept dual citizenship either for immigration or for emigration. The yellow and the turquoise colored countries on the map have asymmetric toleration, as I explained before. Look at this contrast. This is North and South America. There are only Mexico, some Central American states, and Chile left as countries that do not accept dual citizenship for their immigrants, but do accept it for immigrants. Look at Africa. It's again a majority of countries that are fully tolerant, but some significant ones that are holding out against this trend. And here is the contrasting picture for Asia, where you see this big chunk of red color in South and East Asia. And interesting enough, these are the most populous countries in the world. So it's China, India, Pakistan, also, as we will see on the next slide, Indonesia, but also South Korea and Japan that do not accept dual citizenship as a matter of principle. Oceania, Australia and New Zealand, it's a non-issue, has been accepted for a long time. but Indonesia is reluctant to do so. So that's the global picture. That's just a description. Now let's try to explain somehow how this trend has happened and what has driven it. If you want to summarize it in the shortest possible way, you can say there were two main drivers for global toleration of dual citizenship. One is international relations, and the other one is international migration after the Second World War. In international relations, again, you can break it down into two items. One I would call peace, and the other one human rights. By peace, the decline of interstate conflict in the UN world compared to all previous periods of humanity meant that states had much fewer reasons to be basically suspicious about other states and wanted to make sure that their citizens have a unique loyalty to only them and to no other sovereign. If you think we live in a Hobbesian world where sovereigns are constantly potentially at war with each other, then it's quite natural for states to say that we cannot have any subjects who are also loyal, have duties of loyalty to another sovereign. That is no longer the post-45 world. So states could relax their suspicious attitudes towards dual citizens for that reason alone. And the second one, if I've already mentioned that somehow, is the human rights revolution. Suddenly, the individual, also in international relations, is no longer seen as just a subject of state sovereignty, but as a bearer of rights. And among these rights are rights of non-discrimination, especially on grounds of gender, which brought a big boost to toleration of dual citizenship by birth and through marriage. And also the norm of avoiding statelessness. Before World War II, there was a doctrine in international law that said there are two evils in the field of nationality law. One is multiple nationality, the other one is statelessness, and they are both evils of the same magnitude. This has dramatically changed, with states agreeing that statelessness needs to be avoided, but disagreeing whether multiple citizenship also needs to be prevented. The second set of drivers has to do with international migration. This is about primarily a story about sending states. You know, we in the north and in the west of this world tend to think about migration always from an immigration perspective. But the big change actually came from the countries of origin. Until the mid-20th century, countries of origin generally tended to regard their expat populations, their immigrants, as lost populations. Some also wanted to get rid of them. Some thought these were people who were disloyal just because they had emigrated, they had left the fatherland. This attitude has changed in a dramatic way. More and more states consider that diasporas, as they are now called, as a resource in economic sense, because they send back remittances, but also as a political and cultural resource that they can use in international relations to increase their standing and their potential. And that also means that the diasporas in turn have gained power vis-a-vis their countries of origin in many cases. And what we see, especially in some of the European cases where states changed their position from non-toleration to toleration, it was the diaspora lobbies that were very powerful and active in bringing about this change. There is also a change in the receiving countries of immigrants. This happens more and applies more to democracies in the Western world that have realized that they want their immigrants to eventually become citizens. They want them to integrate not just socially and culturally, but also politically. And they realize that asking these immigrants to renounce their citizenship of origin is a huge obstacle and a disincentive for them to be willing to naturalize and adopt the citizenship of their host country. So this demand has been more or less dropped by countries that said it's a priority for us to open access to citizenship, to set our immigrants on the pathway to citizenship. Thirdly, we also need to consider what is the interest of individuals in dual citizenship specifically. And the simple answer to that is dual citizenship provides mobility opportunities. It allows people to travel freely between two countries because each of these countries is obliged under international law to take them back without any conditions. Actually, the right to return to your country of nationality is one of the strongest rights in international human rights because it's not conditional on any other conditions as the other human rights. It's nothing to do with public safety and public health and issues that might now come. States are obliged to readmit their nationals. Some of them don't do this, but it's a clear violation of their international obligations if they don't. Now, that means that the individuals with multiple citizenship have the right of free movement between two states. And that is a great attraction in our world today, where states still exercise sovereign rights over immigration control. Now, interesting enough, that's not the only interest of individuals. There is a new book by Yossi Harpas that I strongly recommend to you. It's called Citizenship 2.0. where he studies middle classes in what he calls the second tier countries. So the non-Western world, but not the poorest countries. And he finds there a middle class that is interested in digging up their ancestry in European nations in order to claim citizenship through descent if they can do so. And many European countries do offer that possibility. So there are millions of Italians, people of Italian descent in North and South America. And in South America, that offer has been taken up by a large number of people, not because they want to go to Italy, but because they want a European passport. And interesting enough, they want the passport not just because they might eventually go to Europe and access the labor market there, but also as a political insurance in case the situation gets worse in their country. They know they can leave. But it's something they also want to have as long as they stay. And Yossi finds even that many people say today, it's a matter of prestige. You know, I can waive my second passport and that will raise my social standing in my country of origin. I don't need to go there. So let me briefly also say something about the specific context of the EU. And here I refer to a recent report by Luc van der Baren, also made for the Global Citizenship Observatory, in which he looked at the EU states. And what he finds there is there are 16 member states that apply no restrictions to dual citizenship whatsoever. But that doesn't tell you how many people actually have the opportunity to have dual citizenship. So he then used this idea of citizenship constellations to look at the pairs of countries, the possible pairing of countries in creating dual citizenship. And these are in the range of 750 something possible pairs or dyadic constellations. And he finds something very interesting. If you look at the number of naturalizations of mobile EU citizens, so EU citizens who reside in another member state, then 92% of those who have naturalized in the year of 2018 did so in a constellation where both their country of origin and their host country accepted dual citizenship. So it's very likely that that was the condition for them being interested in naturalization in the first place. You know, the 8% who naturalized outside, and that includes, by the way, Austria, just means there's a huge disincentive inside the EU against naturalization if you cannot retain your citizenship of origin. Now, you might say, prima facie, this is puzzling. Why? Because once you have EU citizenship, I am a singular citizen. I am an EU citizen too, so I can exercise my right of freedom of movement. But very interestingly, it shows that people attach also identity value to their citizenship of origin. Citizenship is not just about the instrumental value that freedom of movement might bring. It's also that they're unwilling to give up their identity, especially under conditions where they don't get many additional rights through naturalization, apart from the right to vote in national elections. Now let me come to the deviating cases and also to the objections. You know, I'm not making here propaganda speech for dual citizenship. I'm trying to explain patterns and trends, and you also have to look at the counter trends and the deviations in order to understand better how strong this trend is. I've already showed you on the map how South and East Asia is generally very reluctant to tolerate dual citizenship. And if you look more closely why they do so, the first thing that comes up is a very strong nationalist ideology and interpretation of what sovereignty means. So these countries are in a way stuck in an older mode of thinking about sovereignty as being exclusive, not just with regard to territory, but also with regard to people. You cannot share your subjects or citizens with another state. And this is what dual citizenship eventually means. There is a second reason that is more specific and contextual, that some of these countries, and now I'm referring specifically to India and Pakistan, have been involved in territorial conflicts. The partition of British India in 1947 was a huge disaster. It cost millions of human lives. And both countries are extremely fearful of the potential of Indian origin citizens in Pakistan and vice versa, claiming a dual citizenship status between these two states that are still in a way locked into enmity, as we now see in the re-flaring conflict in Kashmir. There is another type of territorial conflict that dampens the enthusiasm about dual citizenship that we find in the neighborhood of Russia, in the post-Soviet states. In 2008, Russia intervened in Georgia. There was a war between Georgia and Russia. And what it did was it handed out citizens to Abkhazians and South Ossetians, and then said, this is our reason why we have to intervene, because we have to protect our Russian citizens that were first created through a Russian policy that is now called passportization. That was a way of destabilizing neighboring countries through citizenship policies. Russia is doing something similar in the cases of Transnistria and Eastern Ukraine. Also there, it comes, Eastern Ukraine, it came after the conflict and the annexation of Crimea rather than before. But this creates a backlash reaction by those states, by countries, for example, the Baltic states, also Georgia, that see themselves as being the potential victims of Russian passportization policies, and therefore will not tolerate dual citizenship. So what that means is the drivers of toleration that I've talked about before are general and widespread. They're of a global nature, whereas the deviations and conflicts are rather particular and contextual. And this supports the hypothesis that it's really a strong and rather robust trend. Also, I will come at the very end to some cautionary scenarios, how that trend might be reversed or stopped. I've already said what this means for the individuals in terms of free movement, corridors that multiple citizenship creates between states. There is a second contradictory effect that has come to the fore in the so-called war against terrorism. And that is recently also surfacing in the debate in Austria, how to react to the terrorist attacks of November 4. And this is, if states subscribe to the prevention of statelessness, it means they cannot deprive people of their citizenship if they have only that one. But they can deprive them of their citizenship if they also have another nationality. And this is what Austria is currently considering. The terrorist who killed the 4 people in Vienna had a second nationality. That was that of Northern Macedonia. He had been born and grown up in Austria, but inherited that citizenship. Now, if Austria could take away Austrian citizenship, that person would become a liability of Northern Macedonia. Northern Macedonia would have to admit him and probably put him on trial for a crime that he had committed in Austria. It's something, it's a way, that whole idea of depriving people of their citizenship because of terrorist activities is a way of responsibility shifting in the international state system that will, by its own logic, also undermine the incentive for states to collaborate in the fight against terrorism. If I can pass on the buck to you, then you have very little to collaborate with me in fighting terrorism preventively. So I don't think this is a promising strategy, but unfortunately it's gaining ground because governments see this as something that is appealing to people who see citizenship only through the domestic lens. These people are unworthy to be our citizens and don't consider what citizenship means in the international realm, which is an allocation of responsibility for individuals to states. Now, that's already my penultimate slide before I come to my conclusions. There is another trend that has been much debated in the literature that Christian Jopke, also a famous sociologist who writes on the topic, calls it the lightening of citizenship. Peter Spiro, a US lawyer, with important books on citizenship, calls it citizenship in decline. And that's the idea that citizenship is rapidly losing its identity value because it's increasingly being instrumentalized by individuals and by states. It becomes something that you try to get because it's good for you and you can achieve your goals, but it's no longer intrinsically valuable. Now, as I said before, that if that really is the new trend in globalization, there is a problem because the Westphalian function of citizenship in the international state system really has to rely on states mutually acknowledging citizenship as valid forms of responsibility allocation. They have to accept that somebody is a citizen of another state. Now, let me take the example illustrated by the picture that you see to the right. This is a photo of so-called bidoons in the United Arab Emirates who are protesting against the policy of the UAR that consisted in buying them. The bidoons, I have to say, are a stateless minority in Kuwait and in the United Arab Emirates. They don't have citizenship of those states, although they are not immigrants. They are a native minority. Now, coming under criticism internationally for this situation of protracted statelessness, these two states came up with an ingenious solution. Oh, let's buy them another citizenship. And they made a deal with the West African island state of the Comoros and paid them a lot of money for issuing Comoros passports for these bidoons so that they would no longer be stateless. But in the passport, it said the holder of that passport is not allowed to enter the Comoros. So, that's clearly a case where the whole institution of citizenship, that means you have to admit your nationals to your own territory, becomes obsolete, It's something else we're talking about. It's not citizenship in the international system. And if states do this kind of thing, they will undermine the integrity of the citizenship regime. Let me mention the other policy that I've already alluded to when talking about Russia and Georgia and Ukraine is an ethno-territorial outreach of states when they try to bestow citizenship on ethnic kin minorities in their neighborhood. And they can do so for different reasons. In the case of Russia, it's very clearly the intent to destabilize neighboring states or to fuel frozen conflicts there. In the case of Hungary, which is another much debated case, Hungary in 2010 introduced dual citizenship toleration, and in 2011 gave voting rights to the Hungarian expats, or so-called expats, the kin minorities in the neighboring countries. And these votes actually the voters were so grateful to Viktor Orban that they provided him with the additional mandate he needed in order to get his constitutional majority in the Hungarian parliament. They keep voting for Orban ever since in huge numbers. So it's more or less a strategy of manipulating the domestic electorate by extending it to groups abroad that will be loyal to the incumbents. Again, a very dangerous game that shows that dual citizenship is not always the nice liberal thing. It also can have a dark side. Then there is the commodification of passports that I've already illustrated in a way with the Comoros example. But in the Comoros, it's a case of giving citizenship to a minority that doesn't want it. In other countries, it's countries offering their citizenship in a global market for investors. This is a game that was started by some Caribbean island states, but it was picked up by other small countries. They're usually small island states or middle income states with attractive visa or tax regimes. So if the state is sufficiently small, then selling your passport might actually be a significant part of state revenue. And that is the case in Europe, specifically for Cyprus and Malta, because what they are selling is not the value of Maltese or Cypriot citizenship. They are selling EU passports, which are, of course, on top in the global ranking when it comes to what that passport gives you access to, which is freedom of movement in 27 states. So the EU has become very concerned about this and has passed several resolutions and has just now started an infringement procedure against Malta and Cyprus on grounds that they are violating EU solidarity and other soft clauses in the EU treaty. The jury is still out whether they have a legal ground, because in the EU citizenship is derivative from nationality of the member states, and the EU doesn't have competence to regulate the acquisition of nationality, although it has gained some competence through jurisprudence of its court in regulating the loss of nationality when it entails the loss of EU citizenship. The final point here is ancestry-based multiple citizenship. So I forgot to say that the middle image that you see there, that's a picture of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese journalist that was murdered for her investigations into government corruption. And what is less reported is that one of the issues that she was investigated was corruption linked to the sale of Maltese passports. So it's a rather dirty business. Now, the final point I want to make here about instrumentalization affects many more states and many more individuals globally, and this is access to multiple citizenship through ancestry. Not descent, which is you get it immediately from the parent, but more distant forms of ancestry. Consider the case of Spain and Portugal that introduced in the last 10 years a restoration of citizenship for Sephardic Jews that were chased out of these countries in 1492 and 93. The descendants of these people, living in Israel and in the US and elsewhere in the world, have very little link to Spain and Portugal. But of course, Spain and Portugal offer them European passports. So there is it's a quite interesting offer. And here they don't have to pay for it. They just have to have the right ancestry to get it. And of course, if that comes closer to the present time, there may be an actual justification for these policies. Austria in 2019 changed its law to allow the acquisition of citizenship, not just for the victims of the Holocaust, the remaining survivors outside Austria, but also for their descendants, arguing that if the Holocaust generation hadn't been deprived of Austrian citizenship, then their descendants would be Austrian citizens by birth. So therefore, we have a duty of reparation to restore their citizenship. Let me conclude and sum up and conclude with an open question too. So what we see is a robust trend towards toleration of dual citizenship around the world, mostly in response to migrants' genuine links to two countries. And that is compatible with the Westphalian function of citizenship of allocating responsibility between states. And it's also compatible with democratic norms of who should be a member of a democratic polity. If people have genuine links to two countries, then they can reasonably be seen as citizens in two self-governing states. However, there are forms of purely instrumental uses of citizenship by both states and by both individuals that piggyback on this norm of a genuine link, that individuals and states should be linked in order to justify citizenship. But they piggyback, and by doing so, they also erode the underlying idea that states can trust each other only if they know that citizenship is based on genuine links. Now, what dual citizenship does in the current world is something very important. I've already mentioned that it opens free movement corridors between two states. If you look at the current world, in which all states claim a sovereign right of immigration control, there are two ways how free movement can be promoted and expanded. One is through forming regional unions like the EU, but the EU is not the only game of that kind. Look at Mercosur, look at even ECOWAS in Western Africa. They are free movement regions based on a common nascent form of supranational citizenship. So that's one way how you can bring about free movement. And the second way is toleration of multiple citizenship, which will give more people access to free movement rights. This works well in a world in which states control immigration, and immigrants have to integrate into largely sedentary populations. Now, if you flip this around, and if you imagine a scenario of hyperglobalization, in which borders would be open and the majority of people would be mobile all the time rather than settling down and becoming sedentary, then probably you couldn't sustain that regime anymore. The only citizenship that would make sense in such a world is you become a resident in a territory, you are a citizen for the time being, as long as you are a resident, and then you move on, you lose your citizenship, you acquire the next one. Citizenship would become something very different. It would no longer mean being a member of a political community across generations. It would be just protection by the state for the time that you reside in its territory. I don't think we are moving that direction. This is the scenario of citizenship becoming ever more lighter, and I don't buy it. I see, on the contrary, a possibility of a counter trend. And that has been highlighted by the pandemic, and I think it will be highlighted even more strongly by the climate crisis. That states have reasons to try to curb mobility. And since multiple citizenship is mainly, a pathway to mobility in the international system, and people are interested in it because it gives them mobility, then deglobalization, where states retreat again into their national borders, might affect negatively both the supply and the demand for dual citizenship. I'm not entirely sure this is going to happen. Why? Because if you think rationally, both pandemics and global climate change require a different kind of response. They require a globally or at least regionally coordinated response. And that approach would go well together with recognizing the trend of to dual citizenship as long as it's connected with genuine links. But I'm not entirely sure that states will not fall into this trap of a nationalist backlash that will lead us to a form of globalization where dual citizenship again becomes something rather problematic. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Professor Bauböck, thank you very much. In this situation, usually you would get a big round of applause down in the Festsaal. Again, we just imagine that. And thanks a lot for a very stimulating talk. There was lots and lots of information in there. And I'm going to open up now for discussion. There was a hand up there. That's Daniel. So, and just unmute yourself. Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for your wonderful presentation. I prepared two questions which I am very interested in. First, you've mentioned the different standards among Europe, particularly in the European Union. And you've also mentioned the cases with Cyprus and Malta. And I'm wondering, what do you think, should there be a common European position on dual citizenship, especially to these Southern European states? That's the first question. The second one is following. Yeah, what is your position on a relatively, in my opinion, a low level of language which is needed when applying, for example, for an Austrian citizenship, which I found out that it's B1 level, and compared to studies at the University of Vienna, which is actually C1 level. So what would be your comment on that? Thank you.
I would be interested in two things, actually. The first one is you said towards the beginning that that the trend towards dual citizenship is linked to more emphasis on human rights, and that I think makes a lot of sense. What we see in the last 5 years that human rights, to a considerable extent, actually come under pressure. So if one looks in debates amongst the diplomatic community in Geneva, for instance, then it seems that certain standards that at some stage were widely accepted are maybe no longer that readily accepted. Do you expect that that may have some effects on practices of dual citizenship? And yeah, and then the other one about your slide at the end, deglobalization is also one of those concepts that I try to grapple with. And to me, sometimes it seems that, yes, so rationally speaking, there is a demand for solutions that point very much towards global governance, towards global solutions, or perhaps regional solutions, but definitely solutions that go beyond state borders. And on the other hand, there is this trend that states are, or those acting, representing states, are oftentimes increasingly more unwilling to follow through with that. So it seems to me sometimes that in terms of the policy pressures, there is an ongoing globalization. And in terms of the responses, there's more and more deglobalization. I was wondering what you think about that.
Okay, so thanks, Daniel. I didn't understand much of what you said initially, but I think I got the first question, which was about Malta and Cyprus, and whether there should be or there is a common EU position on multiple citizenship generally. No, as I mentioned briefly, the EU is a peculiar type of polity in which that has its own citizenship, EU citizenship, that comes also with political rights. But that citizenship is derived from the nationality of the member states. And it says very explicitly in the treaty that determining who is an EU citizen is the exclusive competence of the member states. So member states can always say there is nothing that the EU as a whole, either the Council or the Parliament or the Commission, can do in order to force us to change our nationality laws. On the other hand, it's quite interesting if you compare historic examples. And what I have in mind here is, for example, the Nordic Passport Union that emerged after World War II briefly. When these countries came together, they came up with something similar. They said, we want to have freedom of movement within the Nordic states, also access to the labor market. And a condition for all states to participate in that regime is that they are willing to harmonize their nationality laws, because each of these states creates free moving citizens for the rest of the union. That same logic holds in the EU. But no, in the moment when the treaties were hammered out, Maastricht, the Amsterdam, also the Lisbon Treaty, states were just not willing to jump that hurdle and to accept any EU competence in harmonizing nationality laws. I think it would be perfectly possible to say that member states create their own nationals, and these nationals are the EU citizens, but member states do so within a certain bandwidth of rules. There should be minimum standards for creating citizens. So, for example, that you cannot sell passports to people with no connection to the EU whatsoever. And there should be maximum standards for how demanding access to citizenship can be, so that third country nationals that have lived in EU member states for 10 years and haven't committed any crime must have a reasonable chance to become EU citizens. We are still not at that point. I think it's highly desirable. I think it's unlikely to happen. As I mentioned before, the movement has so far been on with regard to loss of citizenship. If somebody takes away nationality and the person thereby also loses EU citizenship, then the EU has a say. Why that? Because that deprives the person not just of nationality, but of the right of free movement that they previously enjoyed. So they are protected as EU citizens against the member states' policies that are disproportionate and don't take into account EU law in that regard. By the way, let me just mention there's an interesting case, an Austrian case that is now pending at the court in Luxembourg, which involves an Estonian citizen who naturalized in Austria, applied for naturalization, got from Austria the assurance that she met all the criteria for naturalization, and then had to go to Estonia in order to be released from her Estonian citizenship as is required under Austrian law. When she was released, she went back to the Austrian authorities who said, oh, by the way, now we see you have 2 more traffic violations. We retract our offer to naturalize you in Austria. You can no longer become an Austrian citizen. But she had already lost her Estonian citizenship. So she is now permanently stateless because of that. The court said this looks like a case where the EU might want to have a say, and for good reasons. Beyond that, I'm not optimistic that the EU, anybody in the EU, either the Parliament or the Commission, or let alone the Council, would agree on a common policy on multiple citizenship. There are countries that say that inside the EU, it makes no sense whatsoever to discriminate against multiple citizens. Germany, for example, changed its policy in 2 steps and now does not accept dual citizenship for third country nationals, but it accepts it unconditionally for EU citizens. Because it says this is a political community of solidarity and trust. We cannot possibly signal that we mistrust other member states by denying them the right to hold on to their nationality. So, and other countries like Austria, are on the other side of that debate, including the Netherlands also, who are not willing to give up on that idea of mono-nationality as the only thing that is compatible with their sovereignty. I've talked much too long about this. Very briefly on your second question with regard to the language level that is required for naturalization. That differs strongly across countries. In the Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, you have very demanding requirements which keep out the Russian-speaking population there. In Austria, it's the mid-level, B1, but the level was raised. Before that, it used to be A2 or A3. And now they moved it to B1 in order to make it more difficult. It's not at the level that you need to study at the university, because citizenship shouldn't be something that you can get only if you are educated at the university level. There is a problem in seeing citizenship in terms of class, which is in Austria very often the case, not just because of the tests and the language requirement, but mostly because of the income requirement. Austria keeps out a large proportion of its third country nationals from citizenship because it requires that they haven't been welfare dependent and that they have had an income that many Austrian citizens cannot achieve. And that reproduces class differentiated access to citizenship that we know from the 19th century. It just applies it now to the non-nationals. Markus Kornprobst's question on human rights under pressure and deglobalization. Well, we would have to look more closely at what human rights we are talking about. I mentioned already in the context of the war against terror, human rights have become under pressure in a big way. Even the right not to be tortured, which is considered one of the absolute human rights, was challenged, by the US administration in the early 2000s in response to 9/11. But multiple citizenship, is specifically a result of non-discrimination on gender grounds. And here I would still be slightly optimistic that we are not seeing a wholesale backlash where gender discrimination is again becoming legalized. Also, we have to be cautious. Look at Hungary and Poland and their recent legislative initiatives. They are not yet targeting, well, in the case of Poland, they are targeting women. In the case of Hungary, it's more LGBT rights. But our previous notion that sexual orientation and gender will fade away as grounds of discrimination in the democratic world have been probably a little bit too optimistic if you look at these examples. I don't think there will be a wholesale counter trend. But once nationalist populist regimes gain power and can actually try to propose such laws, it's very likely that they will do so. Will they also challenge the independence of nationality of women? I'm not so sure they would. I don't think this is their main interest, especially because some of these countries themselves promote multiple nationality. Look at Hungary. It would be a little bit strange to say we want dual nationality for our kin minorities abroad, but we insist that a woman marrying a Hungarian national loses automatically her citizenship of origin, going back to the early 20th century. That is not, I think, not yet the case, although one should never be too optimistic about the future. With regard to globalization, deglobalization, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, rational solutions require global governance, but you know, even a little bit more modesty, they require international collaboration. That's not something extraordinary. This is what the international state system is meant to allow for and promote. If states are willing to collaborate, then they have also reasons to tolerate dual citizenship. But in a crisis mode, you know, the financial crisis, the pandemic crisis, and the climate crisis, if the three pile on top of each other, then we might see not just deglobalization, but also de-democratization, you know, the rule of law going down the drain in some countries. And if that happens, the most likely legitimacy of these governments will come from national sources, you know. It's their appealing to national identity and mobilizing it against the outside world. America first, and then Hungary first, and then France first, if the Rassemblement National gains power. That will be the game of these forces. In that logic, dual citizenship would be a natural target. It would be quite obvious why they would want to prevent it and go back to an earlier stage of history where it was seen as an evil. I think there have been more questions coming in, so I will try to keep my other answers shorter.
Now there are really lots, and thank you. There are really lots of questions, and I'm going to change my strategy now. But I always do 5 at a time, and I'm going to start with 5 students, with Katharina, then Sarah, Caroline, Evelina, and Veronica. So Katharina, you're first.
Thank you so much for this very informative presentation. I actually have 2 questions. The first one is about the Mexican case that you actually mentioned in one of your articles, where you said that the toleration of dual citizenship and the introduction of external voting rights was a step in a project of promoting the Mexican global nation. But my question would be, how, in your opinion, dual citizenship is impacting national identity in a long term in this case? And is it possible that due to multiple citizenship, the notion of nationhood will disappear? And the second question will be about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict that you mentioned before, but not about bestowing the citizenship for certain purposes, but other risks that arise with the dual citizenship. So there is a risk, for example, of many people in Ukraine having Russian citizenship, and then from the the point of view of the national security, this produces a lot of dangers, like the access to state secrets or the risks of separatist moods arising in society in Ukraine. Also, the possibility of escaping criminal prosecution for Russian citizens. So is there any potential solution in this case? And can we legally exclude one country's citizenship from being tolerated and then accept dual citizenship for all the others? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Sarah is next, please.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. I actually also have 2 questions. The first one, you mentioned the robust trend towards tolerance of dual citizenship, but why actually is Austria so reluctant to grant dual citizenship? And my second question concerns a frequently mentioned criticism of dual citizenship. In Germany, there has been a debate on dual citizenship with opponents arguing that it may lead to conflicts of loyalty and thus hinder successful integration. And what is your opinion on that? And or what can be done to prevent such potential loyalty conflicts? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Caroline is next, please.
Yes, first of all, also thank you for the interesting lecture.
I think my question is actually related to Sarah's question because it comes from a viewpoint of international law. And I know that there has been quite a long debate in international law, especially in Europe, about dual citizenship, and also I would say some hesitation or even objection, because as you mentioned, citizenship entails mutual rights and obligations. So I think sometimes there might be certain problems. Example, if one individual with a dual citizenship gets into trouble in another country, and then he wants to get his right of diplomatic protection. But with dual citizenship, of course, then the question is which citizenship prevails. And I know that there's the possibility of the stronger factual link theory, and also that you could sign like a standard form in which you decide which citizenship you want to prevail or prefer. But my question to you would be whether you think this is an obstacle that could be overcome, or whether this is really a legitimate objection from the international law point of view.
Thank you. And then we have, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go on, no, 4 and 5, 2 more. That is Evelina, please.
Hi. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. My question is, despite the willingness of many countries worldwide and also in Europe to allow and grant dual citizenship, there are still countries who impose some internal, so to say, limitations to dual citizenship. And the example I could give is that diplomatic services in Bulgaria, for example, don't allow dual citizenship for their employees. I would like to hear how would you explain that, and do you think such measures are justified? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there's the last one for this round. That's Veronica.
Yes, I would also like to thank you for the interesting presentation. And I would like to ask you about using the dual citizenship as a political tool. You mentioned the Hungarian case that the government gave the right to vote to its minorities living abroad. Do you think a situation like this could be changed or prevented by the European Union, or how this could be controlled? Thank you.
Veronica, thank you. And Professor Bauböck, finally, I'm going to hand over to you again.
Okay. So, lots of issues there. I'll try to keep it brief. First, Katarina, on the Mexican global nation. I'm glad you dug up this very old article of mine that I had really forgotten about. This is something that is not unique to Mexico, but it's linked to what I said was the incentive for sending states to link up with their diasporas, not just for economic reasons, but to strengthen their profile in the world in a way. And usually that comes with a rhetoric that the diaspora is part of the nation, you know, they belong to us. In Austria, they're sometimes called the 10th federal province, right? This is claiming a population outside your borders for yourself. Mostly this is only symbolic. In the case of Mexico, it's sensitive because some people in the US said, oh, they are reclaiming New Mexico and Texas, right? They want to undo 1848, right? But that's usually just symbolic. This talking about a global Mexican nation doesn't mean global Mexican jurisdiction. It just means accepting that citizens out there are a valuable resource for the country. And as the political geographer Ellen Gamlin has pointed out in a recent fantastic book, this is something that has become normal, just like it used to be normal for states to have a national airline. Now it's normal for states to have a ministry or state secretary for the diaspora. So I think we have to deal with this and live with it, because there's also a reasonable side to it. You know, people who, first generation immigrants who have left the country have good reasons to claim that they still have genuine links to that country, especially in a globalized world where they can communicate and travel back and forth. Secondly, your question was about Ukraine and Russia. The problem that may arise if Russian Ukraine dual citizens, promote separatism or escape prosecution. First of all, Ukraine was one of those countries that reacted very strongly against this and therefore don't tolerate dual citizenship. Why don't they do it? Because they're afraid of Russia. That's the main reason. They deprive themselves of the opportunity to link up with their Western diasporas in order to protect their territory against Russian interference. Therefore, they are very, very worried about that problem. Now, just the second part of your question is, can a country legally exclude one particular state from dual nationality if they think that state will use it against them? And here the answer, I think, is no. That's not possible. In nationality law, you find all sorts of discriminations, but I haven't seen a case where there is a negative discrimination that excludes a particular country of origin from toleration of dual citizenship. There is positive discrimination, as in the case of Germany, for example, where only nationals of EU member states will be accepted as dual citizens, but no third country nationals. But you couldn't have a law in Germany that says, and by the way, Turkey specifically is excluded and all the rest will be admitted. So here I think there's a problem with the generality of law. It's not the language of law that allows you to do this. Sarah's question, why is Austria reluctant? I have a separate paper on that puzzle that I won't be able to sum up, but co-authored with Gerd Feichels, who is the real expert on Austrian nationality law. So I think we have two answers to this. One is the evolution of the Austrian party system. Until roughly the late 1980s, the dominant grand coalition parties of the ÖVP and SPÖ, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, were not interested in citizenship at all. And that, to me, has something to do with Austrian nation building after World War II, where there was the idea that we have to re-establish Austria in a way as a cultural nation without saying it's a German cultural nation, right? And that ambiguity left a lot of made it impossible in a way to assert citizenship as some kind of identity instrument that could be used easily. And what we see then since the rise of the right-wing populist party, the Freedom Party, and the reaction of the centrist party to it by buying into its agenda is that Austrian nationalism suddenly crops up and replaces the old German ethno-nationalism by loading Austrian patriotism with this idea that citizenship is very valuable. It must be very hard to get it. And that demonstrates how worthy it is, how much its value is, And therefore, we cannot make it easier for immigrants to get it. We have to make it more difficult. And that was not just the language requirement and the citizenship test and the income requirements, but also by not giving in an inch with regards to dual citizenship. And my second reason is that it has something to do specifically with Turkey. There's a story that Turkey, in both the cases of Austria and Germany, allowed many of its nationals to reacquire Turkish nationality after they had renounced it in order to become German citizens or Austrian citizens. Under Austrian law, if you reacquire a foreign citizenship, you automatically, ex lege, lose your Austrian nationality. There's no leeway for deciding differently. Now, what happened in the Austrian case is that two politicians, Heinz Christian Strache on the one side, and Peter Pilz, more progressive populist on the other side, claimed they had evidence of Turkish electoral registries that showed that people who had become Austrian citizens and lost their Turkish nationality could vote in Turkey and therefore were likely to be also Turkish nationals. It was a long story in court. Eventually, the Constitutional Court threw this out and said, you can't ask people to prove a negative fact, namely that they are not Turkish citizens. And Turkey refuses to confirm that these lists are official electoral registries. So therefore, that policy has failed. But the suspicion is, of course, that Turkish immigrants in Austria are broadly loyal to the Erdogan regime, and therefore we cannot have them as dual citizens. And that in a way overshadows all the other debates. For example, about the large community of Germans in Austria who might want to be able to politically participate by voting in national elections, but are not willing to give up their German citizenship as the condition for that. Caroline's question, rights and obligations. That has been the big issue in the past. That was the rationale for fighting dual citizenship, and it was specifically military conscription. That was the bone of contention. But there was also an easy solution to this, and it was found it was also anchored in a 1963 Strasbourg Convention on Preventing Dual Nationality. That said, it's 2 chapters. One is, let's prevent dual nationality. The second chapter is, in case where there are dual nationals, let's agree on rules which country has the right to draft them for military service. And the answer is, as you point out, that country where the person has habitual residence, or So, and the same applies to all the other conflicts of loyalties and duties. You just use the principle that is well established in private international law of looking into the strength of factual links, and then you determine in case of conflict which country has precedence over the other country when it comes to imposing certain obligations on citizens. So I think the objection is a legitimate one, but it's not an objection against multiple citizenship. It's an objection that says states have to agree on rules, and if they agree on rules, then they can handle the problem. Evelina's question on restrictions for dual citizenships, dual citizens who have public offices. That's a very interesting one that I've left aside. There are a number of countries that tolerate dual citizenship, but not for certain public office holders. For example, in Australia, you cannot be a dual citizen and a member of parliament. And recently, 5 Australian dual citizens who didn't even know, 2 of them at least, didn't know that they had inherited another citizenship through descent, were deprived of their parliamentary mandates because the constitution says you cannot sit in parliament and have a second citizenship. There was a similar case in Moldova where the European Court of Human Rights decided differently and said it struck down a Moldovan law that tried to ban candidates from running dual citizenship. But the court said, we do this because you introduced that law only in a partisan way to prevent a certain party from running its candidates, and too shortly before the election. So the international courts are more or less open and allow restrictions on holders of high public office who have to renounce one of their citizenship. What do I think about this? I think here there is a reasonable concern. If you're a member of parliament or a minister, the voters have an expectation that you serve their interests. It's a bit like being on a chief executive or being on the governing board of a company. There will be a competition clause that prohibits you from also being on another company. That doesn't apply to individual shareholders who can have shares in both companies, but it applies to the officials that guide and lead the company. And I think you can make an argument like this about states and high public offices, but the solution again is a very simple one. Don't deprive people of their second citizenship. Just tell them to regard it as dormant, to not use it. So they have to sign that they will not use their second citizenship, especially when it comes to political representation issues during the period when they hold office. And then when they leave office, it's restored as it should be, because citizenship is normally the thing that you get for life. Finally, Veronica, can the Hungarian policies somehow be prevented? Well, Hungary, it's interesting to see that the EU Commission and the European Parliament have taken on Malta, Cyprus, and also Bulgaria because of their investor citizenship schemes of selling EU passports. They haven't taken on Hungary because of its policy towards kin minorities, and they haven't taken on Spain and Italy. for giving citizenship to millions, potentially millions of people of Spanish or Italian ancestry abroad. Also, all of these policies create additional EU citizens. I think in the case of Hungary, there is a potential case if you say that it's a breach of trust and solidarity inside the Union if a member state does this in the knowledge that the other member state will not accept it. In the case of Hungary, that was Slovakia. When Hungary introduced dual citizenship in 2010 for the Hungarians in Slovakia, Romania, Vojvodina, and Ukraine, Slovakia reacted by stopping its toleration of dual citizenship and saying, if a Slovak citizen voluntarily acquires another nationality, meaning the Hungarian one, then they will lose their Slovak nationality. So there was a threat that native Hungarian-speaking Slovak citizens would lose their Slovak citizenship because they took up the offer made by Orban. That, I think, is a very dangerous game that the EU, at least for political reasons, shouldn't just stand by and look and say this is within the competence of member states, because it creates potential conflicts. I have to say, however, that the other affected countries have not reacted like this. And they have said, it's okay, it's a domestic issue for Hungary. As long as Hungary doesn't claim back the territory they've lost in the Trianon Treaty of 21, we won't be bothered too much by its dual citizenship policy. And therefore, I think the EU has turned a blind eye.
Thank you very much for answering these questions. I'm gonna do one more round, and in this round we're gonna have 4 via Zoom, and then I'm also gonna read the questions that came to us via Facebook, via the stream. I'm gonna start with Dennis, Vanessa, Afan, and Ivan. Dennis, you're gonna be first.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. The first one regarding the discussion about taking away the Austrian citizenship of some of those people with dual citizenships that joined ISIS, for example. The discussion about the North Macedonian citizenship of the terrorist, of course, is different because he committed his crimes in Austria. But it seems to me that taking away the Austrian citizenships of those foreign fighters is not just a lazy judicial reaction, but also the wrong answer insofar that the Republic basically declares that it does not care about the crimes of its own citizens, which violate fundamentally Austria's values, as long as they can push them away. So I'm surprised and even disappointed that we're having this conversation in Austria, and I would be genuinely curious to hear your take on this issue. And the second one regarding South Tyrolians and the potential of giving them Austrian citizenship, is there a political debate between the parties that it would potentially benefit the ÖVP more than the SPÖ, maybe because South Tyrol is generally more conservative than the average in Austria? Thank you.
Dennis, thank you. And the next question is by Vanessa, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I have 2 related questions or 2 related topics. The first one will be, in our times, to increase the toleration of multiple citizenship, is that a matter of simply strengthening the rule of law, or is it more of raising cultural awareness, for example, by using a tolerant approach to change the legislation? So which will be more important or effective right now? Like the
Can you repeat that question? I'm not entirely sure I understand it. Rule of law versus cultural awareness. What do you mean?
Yeah, so is it more like just strengthening the laws, for example, or is it more like changing or trying to change the cultural perspective? Because you were mentioning that it's different in each country and in each region, for example, and that depends also on the cultural perspective. And the same question will be for example, to end discrimination between men and women regarding the citizenship acquisition, because what I was reading that it's not that common anymore, but it's still happening. So will be also the same question for this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the next one is Afan, please.
Good day. Thank you very much. Do you believe that the dual nationality agreement between Pakistan and Belgium could be a format for other Southeast Asian countries, or to adapt the same format as Pakistan and Belgium have adopted? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Ivan.
Thank you very much for the new insights on this hot topic. But maybe for wrapping up, it made me wonder on some maybe more general philosophical level. So I would have a general comment and maybe a question would be, like, it seems to me that citizenship is something one cannot escape. So in a certain sense, we rarely give consent to citizenship. We are either born into it or acquire it, but some kind of a more or less default procedure. So in a certain sense, one cannot escape it. So, I mean, there are cases of statelessness, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I know, it usually has to do with not having identity documents and not being able to prove identity, and not, it does not have to do with pursuing some inherent belief that I should not have this or that, and that's why I'm a stateless person. So, you know, I always tell this story. I was born in socialist Yugoslavia, and as it got disintegrated, I was acquiring one citizenship after another without ever being asked if I want to have this one or that one. That is to say, it was always attached to a political administrative territory that you happen to occupy. So the question would be more to contemplate, under the law, national and then international, can one renounce citizenship without replacing it with other? So it's more kind of a philosophical question, which maybe does not have conclusive answer. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to add questions that we got via Facebook, and I'm going to add 3 of them if I counted correctly. The first 2 are basically about political science, international relations. The last one is a very practical one. So the first one is about Malta and Cyprus and practices of extending citizenship. Why did the EU change its course now? So what has changed for the EU to take action, or trying to take action? Second one is, what is your explanation of the restrictive approach of Austria and Germany to dual citizenship? The third one is, and I'm going to read it. It is interesting that in both the cases you mentioned of India, Pakistan, and of Russia and its neighbors, countries would like to have more influence over their neighbors. Yet the solutions are the opposite: to resist dual nationality in one case and to hand it out liberally in the other. Can you comment on that? And then finally, are you still okay? And then finally, and I'm just going to read it because it is an issue that is of concern for quite a few people in the city, actually. As a British citizen who has been living and working in Austria for over 30 years, in the wake of Brexit, I will soon lose my right to be a member of the EU. Thus, is there no way that I could gain Austrian citizenship without having to relinquish my British one? So this was the last round of questions, and I'm going to hand over to you again, Professor Bauböck.
Okay. So, which one was the first? The first one was by Dennis, right?
That's right.
Yes. Deprivation from of citizenship for foreign fighters. I fully agree with you. I think the logic here is not that states want to find a solution to the problem how to make sure that suspected terrorists or terrorists who have committed some crimes will be put on trial, put in prison, maybe de-radicalized if that's possible, so that you know, the phenomenon itself can be attacked. What states who engage in these deprivation policies want to do is they don't want to be responsible. They don't want to deal with these people. And if people have multiple citizenship, then it's easy to point to the other state who has to deal with this. And there is a very fatal logic in this blame game, or passing on the buck game, that has been pointed out by a Canadian scholar whose name is Audrey Macklin. And I like this very much. She says, you know, if two states have to deal with a terrorist who has both of their citizenships, and states can deprive terrorists of their nationality, then each state has an incentive to move first and fast, so that the other state will have to deal with that guy. And in order to do so, moving first and fast means they will have an incentive to lower their standards. Instead of accusing people for actual crimes, they will extend it to, you know, having some kind of evidence that these people were considering joining a terrorist organization. And if that's enough, you know, then there will be many extremely dangerous people, you know, in a situation of quasi-statelessness, because no state acknowledges that they are citizens, being passed around. Hannah Arendt has described this for the interwar period, which was really a terrible breakdown of the system of assigned responsibility that citizenship is in international law. So I'm really afraid that the securitizing logic of let's keep the danger away from our territory and let's not consider what that means for other states where we send these people will prevail, especially soon after terrorist attacks. It's no coincidence that in Austria, the first step happened in 2015 after the Bataclan attacks, and now it's happening again after the Vienna terrorist attacks. It's an immediate reaction to terrorist attacks without thinking about whether this is actually a good strategy in fighting terrorism, and I think it's not. The second question was about South Tyrol. I didn't mention this, but the previous government, the government from 2017 to 2019, the ÖVP-FPÖ coalition had a plan to grant citizenship to German and Ladin-speaking South Tyroleans, to grant them Austrian citizenship in addition to their Italian one. So a special exception to the Austrian ban on dual citizenship, with the argument like Viktor Orban made, you know, these are our kin people, and we need to reward them with our valuable citizenship. And I think the logic behind this was, as you hinted in your question, the same in the Austrian case. It was an attempt to get voters. Right? I think not by the Conservative Party, but by the Freedom Party. The Freedom Party had been pushing this for a long time, and they have a base in South Tyrol. And they calculated that if we can manage to give these people Austrian citizenship, they will probably be grateful and will vote for us in national elections. Fortunately, Italy protested strongly against this, and this kind of disappeared from the government agenda even before the government itself collapsed and hasn't been revived since. Vanessa, what comes first, cultural change or the rule of law imperatives? It's almost a chicken and egg problem. It's difficult to say, it probably takes both, but in the case of dual citizenship, I would guess that in many cases, it was surprisingly enough, international law that triggered the change, especially with regard to gender discrimination. I think this happened in Austria at the time in the 70s and 80s when there was not so much cultural awareness about gender equality, but Austria was obliged under international law because of the conventions it had signed to heed the requirements of the CERD, of the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination of Women, CEDAW, sorry, this is CEDAW, and a special convention on the status of women in nationality law. And that just made it impossible to continue. And of course, then I think the fact that women gained independent status in nationality law feeds back into the cultural change. You know, if women are seen as having independent citizenship from their husbands, then that strengthens the perspective of the awareness that they also have a right to equality in other areas of social life. There may have been countries where it worked the other way around, but I would trust a little bit that legal change, even if it comes from the outside, can help to promote also cultural change in some ways. Afan's question about the Pakistan-Belgium agreement, there I have to pass. You know, I don't know that agreement. You know more than me, which is not surprising. But what I can say is there have been in the past one strategy of allowing for dual citizenship where states wanted it, in a way, in the form of positive discrimination, as an exception to the ban, was to conclude bilateral treaties. And Spain did this in a big way with nearly all of Latin American countries and Portugal. And these bilateral treaties had a specific solution to the problem of conflicts of loyalty that we talked about, which is they said a dual citizen, the second nationality, when you're outside the country of that nationality, will be dormant as long as you are in the first country. Right? So if a Spanish Latin American dual citizen moved between, let's say, Peru and Spain, then he was considered a Peruvian citizen while in Peru and a Spanish citizen while in Spain. That also links to the question of diplomatic protection that I now have lost track of who asked that, and maybe it was even in an earlier round. There used to be the idea that you cannot exercise diplomatic protection on behalf of a dual citizen who is in a country of which he is also a national. Seems quite logical, but surprisingly, that's less and less the case. You know, and it was the powerful countries like the US, France, UK, that ignored that rule by saying, we will always protect our citizens abroad, no matter. We don't care if they have another nationality, that doesn't count for us. And there's increasingly also a shift of doctrine in the international law that says, if there is a violation of fundamental human rights by a state, then dual nationality doesn't mean that that the other state can no longer intervene and exercise diplomatic protection for that person. And I think that's a welcome development. So Ivan's question about, or comment rather, that one cannot escape citizenship because it's usually attributed by birth. That's entirely right. You know, there is a whole literature in political philosophy about the birthright lottery. The fact that much of our opportunities, many of our opportunities in life depend on the country with the citizenship of which we are born, by descent or by birth in the territory. That's one of the biggest determinants of your chances in life. And it's a huge source of global inequality, and it's therefore seen as an evil in a way. However, the problem is not, it's not clear what the answer to that problem is. Should we have an actual lottery where, you know, the baby picks a country that is drawn from a lottery at birth and it will be the national of that country? I think that would be even more grossly unjust. And it would undermine the essential function of citizenship, which is to form political communities whose members have something in common. They share something in common. What they share in common in this case is that they were born to citizen parents or born in a territory. But that's a significant fact if you want to create an imagined community that is willing to make sacrifices for the common good. So there is a trade-off between citizenship as it works to promote particular bounded political communities through birthright provisions where you don't choose, you're just assigned that citizenship. And on the other hand, the global inequality across countries that cannot be overcome through reallocating citizenship, but that can only be overcome through reallocating resources. I think that's the right answer to that. And in between, there is naturalization. And that's the minority of cases where people can voluntarily change their citizenship, and they ought to be able to do so when they have established a new genuine link to another country, which is usually through migration. So I think that is the way how to handle these normative trade-offs. Now, the first Facebook question was on Malta and Cyprus and why the EU is acting now. It's actually, it already started to act in, when was it, 2014, I think. when the European Parliament passed a resolution against Malta and Cyprus, and the Commission took up the case, Commissioner Viviane Reding then, and said, you cannot give EU citizenship to any person who doesn't have a genuine link to the EU, meaning to at least one of the member states. If you applied that principle, then many other policies would also be thrown out, that the EU still doesn't try to dare to attack. But in the case of Malta and Cyprus, what in a way was the point where the Commission ran out of patience was the investigation on wide-scale corruption. If you find that it's not just that countries sell citizenship in a transparent way to people who will then benefit from freedom of movement in the EU, it's also that it's a business that breeds corruption, right? And that's one of the reasons why the EU says, well, we have a mandate to fight corruption. So let's go after countries that open that door. And this is, I think, also the Daphne Caruana Galizia case may have also, in a way made the Commission aware that it should follow up on its earlier commitment to try to stop these policies. But as I said before, wait until the court speaks on this. This is about acquisition of EU citizenship, not about loss. And until now, the court has always said this is a domain of member state sovereignty. It's certainly not covered by the treaties in their present version. So they have to use soft clauses about solidarity and trust in the EU in order to make this an EU issue. Second Facebook question about explaining the restrictive attitude in Austria and Germany. I've already talked about Austria, so maybe the question was put before I came up with that answer. I think some of these arguments also apply to Germany, so not all of them. But the one argument that certainly applies is the concern about Turkish immigrants as the largest group, where there is a perceived integration failure, right? Former guest workers with very little education who ended up on the lowest ranks of society and are now instrumentalized by an increasingly authoritarian government in Turkey as its diaspora. That raises concerns of all sorts, and the backlash, the counter reaction is to say, we cannot possibly have them as dual citizens because they are already so loyal towards that regime that we don't want to have in the EU. How can we then admit them individually, as EU citizens by giving them citizenship? The argument on the other side is, in the case of Austria, look, there are 15% of the Austrian population who cannot vote and are not represented in parliament because Austrian citizenship laws are so tough. And that has a lot to do with the non-toleration of dual citizenship. So Germany has de facto opened up much more than Austria. In Germany, it's 50% of all naturalizations where dual citizenship is tolerated. In Austria, we don't know the percentage, but it's certainly much lower. The third Facebook question, I didn't properly understand acoustically. So it was about India and Pakistan and one handing out and the other one refusing citizenship, but I couldn't follow properly what it was. Maybe before we take this up, I'll answer the fourth question about British citizens being in a way stranded in the EU and having no way to retain their citizenship of origin if they want to retain their EU citizenship by becoming EU citizens through naturalization. I think that's a very relevant concern. I was very disappointed when the previous Austrian government said, we'll look into the Austrian citizens in Britain who may have reasons why they want to gain British citizenship. And in case of hard Brexit, we might make an exception to our ban on dual citizenship for them. But it never considered a symmetrical grant of dual citizenship for the British citizens living in Austria. And actually, they lose more, the Austrian citizen, and that includes, by the way, my daughter living in London, through Brexit, she will no longer consider becoming a British citizen, which she did before, because she would lose not just Austrian nationality, but EU citizenship. It would be completely stupid to do so. But she can keep her Austrian citizenship and EU citizenship and still have a kind of secure resident status in Britain. For the British citizens living in Austria, it's much worse. They lose automatically EU citizenship without any choice of theirs. And most of them voted no in the Brexit referendum. So it's a really hard dilemma for them. And I would advocate, and I've advocated in an op-ed commentary, that there should be an exception for them too. But for the individual case, let me just say this: there are certain ways, certain conditions under which you may, actually, it doesn't work that way around. If you are a British citizen living in Austria, you will be treated just like any other citizen applying there, and that goes for whether you are an EU citizen or a third country national. The only case in which you would be allowed to retain your citizenship of origin is if you can't get rid of it. If Britain said, like many of the Arab states do, we don't allow renunciation, then Austria would accept that if you can't renounce, then we can ask you to renounce, so you can retain it. But of course, Britain doesn't do that. And any state that adheres to the rule of law cannot prohibit voluntary renunciation. So I'm afraid it's a failure of Austrian government, and I have no good advice for you. So the question that I didn't understand, what was that about?
I'm going to read it to you then, as it's written in the chat. It is interesting that in both the cases you mentioned, of India, Pakistan, and of Russia and its neighbors, countries would like to have more influence over their neighbors, yet the solutions are the opposite: to resist dual nationality in one case and to hand it out liberally in the other. Can you comment on that?
Okay. Well, the policies are actually quite different. India and Pakistan are certainly worried about each other, but it's not exactly the case that they try to use their former citizens in a way. These are newly created states, so there are no former citizens of those states, but they are not. India is not trying to use the Muslim population that it in a way forced to emigrate to Pakistan in order to destabilize Pakistan. They see them as lost populations they want nothing to do with. And the same goes for the Hindu population that left what is the territory that is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, and had to move to India in order to escape oppression. Again, Pakistan doesn't claim them as potential Pakistani citizens. So these countries are destabilizing each other much more in a classic international conflict scenario, right? Where there is a threat, they're both nuclear powers, and there is the dispute over the province of Kashmir. There is a territorial and arms race conflict between these countries that is extremely dangerous, in which it doesn't make sense for any country to use its potential citizens on the other side as pawns, but rather to keep them at bay. In the case of Russia and its neighborhood, that's very different. It's an extremely asymmetric conflict where Russia is trying to destabilize neighboring countries through, with the goal of re-establishing regional hegemony. Making these countries sufficiently unstable to be able to exercise some kind of security umbrella over them, to force regimes into buying into this idea. And for that purpose, it's very, very useful to have Russian-kin minorities in these countries that are actual or potential Russian citizens. It gives them an additional leverage, how they can operate from inside these countries in order to destabilize regimes that they don't want, or maybe prop up those that they do want. Let me just mention the very interesting case of the recent elections in Moldova. Moldova is a small country, wedged between Romania and Ukraine, that has a lot of immigration that goes both east and west, roughly equal sizes of Moldovan migrants in Russia and in the European Union. In recent elections, what you could find is that, and in Moldovan politics, there are always, basically two parties: a pro-Russian, a pro-Putin party, and a pro-European party. The pro-European candidate won with a large chunk of expatriate votes from Moldovan migrants in the European Union. I've seen a previous study of previous election that showed that the Russian migrants the Moldovan migrants in Russia strongly vote for the Russian party in Moldova. So you see, in a way, a case where it's not just driven by Russia, it's partly driven also by the diaspora patterns in politics in the country domestically, that expat votes can be used to prop up one side or the other side. In the case of Orban, it helps to prop up an increasingly authoritarian regime. In the case of Moldova, you see a different pattern. It has helped to bring to victory a more Western, more European, probably also more democratically oriented candidate. In the literature, this is sometimes called the democratic remittances. Send migrants from a shaky, not so democratic country to a democratic country. And if you treat them rightly, they might re-import the democratic values that they've picked up in that country into the domestic politics of the country of origin. The problem is it doesn't always work. In the case of Turkey, it does not work. It doesn't seem to work particularly well. In the case of Russia, in Hungary, it works in the other way. So we need to be aware of these particular constellations. It's not all the same size. Multiple citizenship is not just about migration issues, it's about a lot of other issues, and we need to be attentive to context in order to evaluate its effect and its impact.
Professor Bauböck, I would like to thank you very, very, very much for a great, stimulating talk, full of information and very convincing arguments, I think. I'd also like to thank you for answering lots and lots of our questions very thoroughly. If I calculated correctly, it was 17 of them actually, and this is where I'm gonna end the discussion here. There would have been even more questions, and apologies to those either via Zoom or via Facebook who couldn't ask any questions anymore. So the virtual round of applause, Professor Bauböck, for you. Thank you very, very much. And perhaps a quick note to our audience. We're going to continue the ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture series with yet another functional order next week. It's going to be a talk by Gabriele Spielker from the University of Salzburg on climate change. And Professor Bauböck, again, thank you very, very much for this great talk.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.